Calm down. Okay. Carrie, I know you've got to run off. So I think probably if I go to the far chair, it's probably best.
Yeah, that's fine. Do you want to go in first?
You're Hi everyone, thank you so much for coming. It gives me great pleasure to say that today we've got Rebecca Nicholson, who is the current editor-in-chief of Vice UK, and who has formerly written extensively for The Guardian. We're now actually going to show you a short video, which is very exciting. It's a plot twist, to give you a little taster of Vice's style and what Vice is about. So, hope you enjoy.
I see disenfranchised young people.
Reality is exciting for young people.
I think we're all a bit real. I think we know where we're from and what we do. You know, we'll give anybody one for the money.
I'm here to collect money. You know what I mean? I don't give a shit. I'll take shit. Yes, I'm serious. I'm a big man. Get up, Calvin. Discipline this week. Don't fucking lie to me. I've had 4 or 5 attempts on life. I told them what I'm fucking dying.
I'm double the school schools. I've accumulated between 10 to 30 million pounds.
So what's the Chinese? The really thought was as easy as that. A bit drunk. Understand? This is a bit like it, isn't it? Ran out of a shot in the night. What was I thinking? What? Thinking, fuck all. 10-year sentence.
Most 15 or 14-year-olds actually think, oh, we're going to move to London.
This is the healing as an artist. As an artist, it doesn't talk about, okay, one of these, this is the brain.
Big man. That's a man.
I mean, I don't know so much about cosmetic surgery, although I love it.
We don't have any excuse to dress up in lips to get into town, so.
Everyone was saying to me last night, where have you been? Where have you been? Looking around, didn't you? I went, no, I haven't.
So I think my favourite quote from that has got to be, I could sell rice to the Chinese. So that was obviously very individual in style. What would you say it is about Vice that makes it so unique, and how do you create that?
Well, I think watching that, it was very apparent that we shoot a lot of things at night. So
Yeah.
in a light room, it's not that clear to see. I think what Vice is very good at is telling unique stories that you wouldn't necessarily see anywhere else. I think quite often we tell the stories of people who are kind of fall through the cracks of what you might see in the mainstream media. So I think we showed a clip there from the Debt Collector, and that was a TV hour, as they say, but I think it was a 45-minute film about a debt collector in Liverpool, and I don't think there are many people who would make films like that. So to me, it has to be unique, it has to be an interesting story. Every day we have an editorial conference where we look at the news and we say, if we're going to cover this, how would we do it in a way that is distinctly us? And how do we do it in a way that feels as if it wouldn't be seen elsewhere? And you wouldn't see that story elsewhere. You wouldn't see that angle elsewhere. So I think that's what we try to do. Original stories done in a very Vice way, and telling the stories that you wouldn't necessarily hear anywhere else.
Yeah, it occurs to me as though they're not just the way in which you tell the stories are very individual, but you kind of tell the fringe stories that no one else is telling.
Yeah, I think so. And the way in which we tell them as well. I mean, obviously the language on that was fairly rum. And I don't think we would censor that, because for me, it's really important that we're frank and honest.
Yeah.
And I think a lot of what we do has a kind of honesty to it. And people read it for that honesty, I would hope anyway. So yeah, I think we tell stories in a very honest way. I would hope so.
Well, I think linking to that honesty, because obviously I'd say we live at the minute in the era of media spin, How do you think we can make up our minds over what we're reading when there is so much spin going on? What is the truth, if there is a truth in the media at the minute?
Well, personally, as someone who reads a lot of different news sources, I think I've developed a kind of healthy cynicism for everything. I remember we ran a piece last week, I think it was, where we interviewed the guy who hosts the Radio 4 statistics program, and he said, if it sounds suspect, then question it. And I think that's very good advice for anything that you're reading. If something doesn't sound quite right, if that statistic sounds extremely unlikely, then you probably feel that way for a reason. So why? Why do you feel that way? Why don't you trust this? And I think Shane Smith, who is the kind of big overall boss of everything Vice, always says that young people are the most sophisticated people in the media because they've been marketed to from birth, essentially.
Yeah.
And, you know, he says they can spot bullshit a mile off. And I think that I think sometimes people treat their audience as if they're stupid. And that, to me, is the biggest mistake that you can make, because our audience is not stupid in any way. Our audience is incredibly sophisticated. And I think that our audience can spot a mistruth, can spot something that doesn't sound quite right. So we always aim to be honest, and we always aim to be as frank as possible.
Yeah.
So I think I would hope that that's kind of our way of, you know, moving through that spin. There is spin everywhere. It's inevitable. I think some of it's even the kind of spin that you can't help, but that things just kind of have that anyway. But I would hope that we cut through that.
Well, I suppose also spin is often linked to sort of political bias in the media, and certain newspapers sort of known for being either sort of left-leaning or right-leaning. Do you see there to be a particular political bias within British media at the minute?
Across the whole media?
Across the whole media, generally in the UK?
I think that there's a bias towards the established order, and there's a bias towards the kind of established institutions of politics.
Yeah.
And again, at Vice, I think we try to exist outside of that, because one of the myths that you often hear about young people, and that people often talk to me about, is that young people are apathetic and they're apolitical. I mean, I'm sitting here talking to you saying that people say that young people are apathetic. I'm sure that you all have an opinion on that. I don't think that's true. I think in my work and the work that we do, we see activism, we see people organizing grassroots movements, we see protests, and people are doing that off their own bag. And the only thing that, to me, that I see that they have in common is that there's a kind of rejection of the established order. They don't want to be part of a party system that doesn't speak to them and that doesn't legislate for them. I think that's the kind of the truth of the matter. So I think there's a bias towards just accepting the order as it is that we aim to kind of exist outside of. I don't think it suits us to decide that there's a kind of three-party system and that's all you have to choose from.
So you consider Vice to be a lot more neutral in its sort of political...
I don't think it's necessarily neutral, but I think that we have a kind of healthy disdain for things as they are. I don't think it necessarily suits our readers, or our readers don't feel as if it suits them. They don't trust it. They don't trust that system, and I don't blame them, frankly.
Yeah. So linking it to youth then, what do you think sort of young people nowadays look for in the media? What are they looking for?
Again, I feel like I'm speaking to a room full of young people and saying, well, these young people are all looking for this. In my experience, I would say frankness, a kind of honesty. And that's what we try to do. So today, I was just thinking about what we had on the site today. We had a story about the bad batch of ecstasy that's been going around nightclubs. And I saw that story reported elsewhere, but I didn't see it reported in the way that we reported it, which was, if you take ecstasy, avoid this batch. And that seemed like an honest take on that story to me. It wasn't saying ecstasy horror. It wasn't a scare story saying ecstasy will kill you. You will die if you're near an ecstasy. You know, it wasn't that kind of sensationalism. But there was a kind of frankness to that I would have appreciated, I think, if I was, in my teens and reading that. That, to me, felt like a very Vice approach to that story. And the other one was the story about, I think, 25% of mortgages in the UK, the deposits now comes from parents, which is it's 27% actually. I think it's over a quarter, but that's an extraordinary figure to me. And again, the story that we did said, you will not be able to afford a home unless your parents are rich. And that's the kind of angle that I haven't seen anywhere else. That's the implication that some people have kind of brought out, but I think to be so blunt about it, and there was a kind of bluntness, that to me felt like a Vice story. And I think actually one of the biggest stories that we had last month was about the Panama Papers. And we ran a story that was kind of, it was an explainer, and people do explainers across the press. You know, lots of different sites run stories that say, here's what you need to know about this. But the headline for the Panama Papers piece was why you should give a shit about the Panama Papers. And that came from a discussion that we'd had in the office. And the office is like, it's, you know, most of the staff are in their early 20s. It's full of young people. And they were saying like, you know, it sounds like a great story, but why do I care? How does it affect me? And so I said, okay, let's do a story about why it affects you and why you should care. And that was one of the most widely read stories on the site. And it was shared by so many people, and, you know, like, people were kind of tweeting about it, and that wasn't just young people, that was across the age spectrum. And I think sometimes everyone needs to know why they should give a shit about something. You know, there was a lot to get through with that, and that to me was the heart of it. Like, how is this affecting your life?
So it seems like it's kind of accepting reality for what it is, and just sort of writing around that as opposed to avoiding the main issue.
Yeah, I don't think we would ever avoid the main issue. I would hope not.
As in, like, but talk around it.
That story was just based on conversations that we'd had in the office.
Yeah.
And that's one of the nice things for me about working there, is that, you know, lots of people want to reach young people. Again, I don't know why the term makes me wince slightly, because it feels almost patronizing to me. Lots of people want to reach the youth. But lots of people do want to reach young people. But if most of your writing staff are young people, then you don't have to go through that extra step of thinking, I'm going to find a young person and get them to explain their opinion to me, because this is just young people talking about what they want to talk about. Yeah.
And what was it like then going from The Guardian, which is obviously very different in its media output, in that it's print media, and Vice is mainly online platforms. So what, based on your experiences, are the differences between print media and online media?
Well, it's interesting. I don't know would you say that The Guardian is primarily known as a print outlet now?
Well, I suppose there are lots of, for example, so I know various newspapers you can only get online if you pay.
Yeah.
Whereas The Guardian, for example, I know you can read for free, I believe. But what generally then are the differences between print media and online media, if we leave out The Guardian?
Well, I think there are very few instances now of print media without online, so they're always kind of working together. And certainly at The Guardian, it was kind of good to see how they could work together well. So just in practical terms, you know, do we wait to publish this story until the print edition is out, or do we publish it now, and then people will read it when the print edition is out? And The Guardian's approach tended to be, we'll publish it when it's ready, and then the print edition will serve as a kind of, I don't know, like an anthology, I guess, of the previous day's stories.
Yeah.
Other people don't do that. I think the Times has just has decided to do a kind of approach of, they publish stories in the morning, at lunchtime, and in the evening, rather than the story as it's ready.
Yeah.
I've slightly lost my train of thought. I'm just talking about
It's fine,
newspapers
keep
now.
going, I'm intrigued.
It is interesting, because when I left The Guardian to go to Vice, lots of people were surprised, my mum particularly. Why are you leaving a newspaper to go to this website? And should I follow it on Facebook? And I said, I don't know if you should or not. That's up to you.
I think she probably does.
She did, and occasionally, why is this popping up in it? She's not the target audience, it's fine. But it was the kind of, obviously, the immediacy of online is something that appeals to me. I think it's just the speed at which you can get a story out there. Yeah. It's instant. But on the other hand, I would say that I think people are starting to realize, and again, this is something that we kind of do at Vice because we have to do it at Vice because it's a relatively small team. Yeah. But I think people are starting to realize that the value of a kind of quick take story is perhaps not as high as you would think, and the kind of, I guess, for want of a better phrase, clickbait thing, it only goes so far, it only serves a certain purpose. So I think we would rather wait to report a story and do it in our own way
Yeah.
So again, it goes back to
Yeah.
your question about what makes a story a Vice story.
Yeah.
This is a terrible, I apologize in advance for this example, but it's the first one that pops into my head, and it is a slightly strange thing to bring up, but I don't know if anyone saw the story of the Croydon Cat Killer. This is sorry to
Please
to
tell
lower
us.
the tone.
Really intrigued.
But someone is killing cats in Croydon,
Oh my
and
goodness.
en masse. It's been a big local news
Like a
story in
serial
South
cat
London,
killer.
but a serial cat killer. And this was reported across most newspapers, and especially the London papers, that this was happening. And we talked about it again in the editorial meeting. And instead of just writing that story in a slightly different way, and we thought, let's take our time with it, and we'll do some reporting. And it sounds like the most obvious thing in the world, but we'll do some journalism. We'll wait. We don't need that kind of immediate click, because the idea is that people will read something that's more thought through and that's taken more time. So we spent a couple of weeks, we put one of our writers on it and gave him a couple of weeks, and he came back and he said, actually, I found this woman who has kind of set up an amateur detective agency to find the person who's responsible for this. She was called Boudica, which is brilliant. And the society had a name, and I can't remember what it was called, but that to me was worth the wait. That was interested me much more than, than spending, I don't know, a couple of hours writing, this is happening. So, well, what are the other stories behind it? What are the kind of stories that we can find that are interesting?
We're seeing this transition then that we've got at the minute from print media to more online platforms like Vice. Do you see a future for print media? What does the future of the journalistic industry look like for you?
It's an interesting one, and I genuinely don't know. I don't know. Obviously, newspaper sales are declining.
Yeah.
And I was trying to think about it today, because I was thinking, I grew up on magazines. I grew up reading Smash Hits. I grew up reading NME. That was my kind of thing, The Face. And I don't really buy magazines anymore. I rarely buy a newspaper. I read almost everything online. Although I do have subscriptions to newspapers that don't put all of their content online for free. So I do read stuff behind paywalls. But I think the only magazine now that I buy is probably Private Eye, and Private Eye doesn't have an online presence. So I'm getting something that I can't get online there. But then I think people still want to read print. People do still want something physical. I don't know if that will continue. Part of me hopes that it does. But I think there is a shift. It's undeniable, and our challenge as journalists is to work out how we best deal with that. Vice has a magazine, of course, and that works with all of the kind of online platforms that we do. So the documentaries that we showed, the kind of very brief excerpts from, the magazine is the place where you can read interviews with people who are in those films. You can read, an interview with the filmmaker. We might do something on the site that ties into, like we did, again, this is kind of a very Vice story, but we did...
I love hearing these stories.
Yeah, this isn't as bad as the cat killer, I promise. But we did a whole week about chemsex, and it's this kind of, I hesitate to call it a phenomenon because I don't think it is, but I don't know if you know what chemsex is, but it's a kind of it's been called a health emergency by the British Medical Journal, and it sort of largely affects gay men, and they go, this group of men, I'm being very careful with my language about it, but it largely affects gay men. And it's parties where there's a lot of sex and there's a lot of drugs, and it's causing a big sexual health problem in London. And we made a documentary about this, and that took 2 years to film, and then it got a cinematic release, which is the first time a Vice film has been released in the cinema. And so to tie in with that, we did a whole week of editorial around it, and we spoke to people who had made the film, but we also spoke to people involved in the issues around the film. So one of the ones I remember was there's a movement which I knew nothing about, but there's a movement of people who deny the existence of HIV and think they have this kind of conspiracy theory approach to HIV medication, and it's fascinating. I'd never heard this story. It's fascinating. Someone mentioned it in the chemsex documentary, and we went away and found the people and talked to them and did a feature on it. But my point is that the way that we use print is very much as a part of everything else. It's an extra way of viewing things. And the photographs that we take look beautiful in print. They would not look as nice. They don't look as nice online as they do in print. So there are some things that it's useful for. But in terms of its future across the wider industry, I really, really don't know. I don't think anyone quite knows.
No, I agree. I think it is very difficult to predict. You're also talking a lot about Vice journalists going sort of to something that's going on and then finding out about it and writing about it, which obviously comes across quite investigative. Do you think then with investigative journalism that journalists have a sort of moral responsibility or some kind of responsibility as to sort of how they go about investigating and then how they write about that?
I mean, how do you mean moral responsibility?
In that, do you think they have a responsibility, for example, so we're often seeing on the television, like journalists, like crowding into a room, desperate to get like the first quote, that sort of thing.
Yeah, I understand that that's how journalism works,
Yeah.
and I understand that if you're working on a newspaper, then that's part of the process, and that's something that you have to do. Again, I keep saying that we're slightly outside of that, but I think that's not necessarily that we're taking a moral high ground on that. But I just don't think we work in that way. I don't think we need to work in that way because we're not chasing those sorts of stories. We're not doorstepping people because that's not really the kind of stuff that we do. We're not aiming to expose, like that kind of old tabloid trick of exposing people's sexual peccadillos. That's not really something that we're interested in doing. We'll do an investigation into, someone that we believe is doing wrong. But I mean, where does the kind of moral?
Yeah, no, I suppose there is no particular line. It's very difficult.
Yeah, but I think I do try and, again, we're a very small team and they're very young journalists in comparison to the rest of the industry. And so I think in terms of behaving well, that's important to everyone.
Yeah, no, definitely.
Yeah.
And then so we were talking a lot about Vice, so maybe we can move it to The Guardian a bit. Is there anything you'd like to say about your experiences that you had at The Guardian, maybe how they differed from Vice?
I mean, The Guardian's huge in comparison to Vice. Vice is growing, and I think we're probably one of the only places that's hiring people regularly because it's growing so quickly. But The Guardian is huge and has so many talented journalists there, and it was a wonderful place to work. I had such a great time there. I think they're very nurturing of young journalists and people who are interested. They're very encouraging. I learned so much about so many different things. And one thing, again, I was thinking about this today, but one thing that struck me is that during my time there, I had two incredible kind of female members of staff, very high up, who were both very good to me and kind of took an interest in my career, but also taught me so much. And more importantly than that, I really do think it's important to see women in those positions to just make you think it's possible. It's just, you kind of need that template almost to say, oh, that's fine. So Kath Viner, who is now the editor-in-chief, she was the Saturday editor when I worked on the guide there and was really just a great person to watch. And Janine Gibson, who is now the editor-in-chief of BuzzFeed, but she was the editor of Guardian US when I was there, when they won the Pulitzer Prize for the Edward Snowden stuff. I wasn't there at the time. I would love to, that was me. It wasn't. I wasn't there. But again, seeing those women in those positions was a really wonderful thing. I think The Guardian was really great for that.
So am I right in saying you're the first woman to become editor-in-chief of Vice?
I think so. The magazine has an editor-in-chief in the US,
this is
Ellis.
the online.
That's the physical, that's the print magazine. Who in the US, she's the editor-in-chief. But yeah, I think I'm the first female editor-in-chief at Vice. There aren't many of us.
Yeah. Have you experienced then any challenges, like as a woman in the industry, and do you see there to be a particular gender bias at all?
On a personal level, I don't think I could say that I have really, but I'm quite headstrong, and so I don't think there's nothing I could say. There have been a few kind of tiny examples of things that you think, well, that definitely wouldn't have happened if I was a man. I remember once emailing an editor who shall remain unnamed and saying, oh, I've heard this band is in town, I'd really like to interview them. And this editor replied saying, I've already had a couple of pitches from lady writers. I thought, hang on a second. I think I'm just a writer. I didn't realize that I was kind of a lady writer. But I mean, nothing terrible has happened to me personally. But I think there are things that maybe make it not more difficult, but things that you have to overcome slightly as a woman in in journalism. I found as a writer at The Guardian, not particularly at The Guardian, but as a writer particularly, the comment section, I know this has been discussed, The Guardian's doing a lot of work on this at the moment, but the comment section, I think if you are a woman with an opinion, you will always come up against men, and it is men, who resent the fact that you have an opinion. Not the opinion itself, but just the very fact of you having an opinion. And that's difficult. I think you have to be very tough to decide to put your opinion out there, knowing that the fact that your byline is a picture of you as a woman means that you will encourage, see, that's not even the right word to say encourage, but you will receive more vitriol. That just absolutely happens. And I know so many writers who just didn't want to write comment pieces and opinion pieces. They wouldn't write them because the comment section was notoriously vicious. And these were established journalists who had been working for years, and they just stepped away and said, I'm not getting involved in that because I don't want to read the comments.
Do they really affect you, the comment section? Is they something that you sort of choose not to look at? I know some sort of writers, for example, they don't like to look at the criticism that their book recently got, something like that.
Well, I've always had quite mixed views about them, because sometimes I think it's really great to foster a discussion. I don't think a piece should be printed and then and that's it. There's no way of coming back to that. I've always enjoyed a piece being printed and then reading the comments and thinking, oh, there's a debate around this. I'm interested to hear other people's views, and I like to know what people think. On the other hand, there are times when, I've had someone tweet me about my appearance for a piece that I wrote. I don't even think it was a particularly serious piece. But when you get that kind of level of abuse...
your appearance is in, like, what you look
Oh,
like?
I've had that a few times, yeah. It's something... Yeah. I remember once I reviewed... I'm still quite bitter about this one, so I do remember the details. But I reviewed Outkast's comeback show at Coachella. And it wasn't a very good show. And I love Outkast, and I was really excited to see it. And it was a very mediocre show. I think I gave it 3 stars, because it was Outkast. They've got such a great back catalogue. The songs are great, but they didn't seem into it. And I think I said that in the review. And I woke up the next day, and people were saying, you don't know what you're talking about. Essentially, like, you don't know what you're talking about, women. You don't know rap music. You don't know any of this. And by this point, I'd been a music journalist for quite a long time. Like, I had I kind of knew what I was talking about, and I knew what I'd seen. And some guy sent me a really, really abusive tweet, and I can't remember the exact language, but it was really nasty and really horrible. Anyway, about a year later, I think it was Andre 3000, or Big Boy, came out and said, yeah, those shows weren't very good, we really weren't into it. And I just thought, I knew it, I was right. As I said, I'm still quite...
What was it like having the chance to go to, like, Coachella and all those festivals? That's been fantastic.
Yeah, that's
like, a real perk of the
That's a real
job.
perk of the job.
Yeah.
That's incredible. I'd never really travelled much before I was a journalist, and I think that's by far the best part. You get to see the world and speak to interesting people, and yeah.
Where would you say is one of the most interesting places then that you've got to go to as a result of your job? I do languages, so I'm really interested in that.
I got the chance, when I was at The Guardian, I got the chance to go to New York for a few months and to actually live there, and I'd never lived outside of the UK before. And, everyone has their kind of New York story, but I just think living in a city like that was such a wonderful experience and really gave me a kind of strength of character that I didn't have before, because I just thought, if I can do that, then, everything else is easy, it's fine.
Have you got any particular plans for Vice in the future? Anything planned that you're going to do with Vice? Any good upcoming stories you could tell us about?
Oh, I don't know if I can tell you about any good upcoming stories. I think more broadly speaking, I would like it to be taken seriously as I've spoken a lot about existing outside of the kind of, existing outside of the mainstream, and I think that will always be its natural home. But we've had a couple of stories that have been discussed on the Today programme this year, and I do get a little bit of a thrill knowing that, I still see it as a kind of scrappy website, but knowing that that kind of is being taken seriously, and I think it should be taken seriously. So that's my hope, that it continues to be taken seriously and becomes more widely read. And yeah, sorry, that's a bit vague, but...
No, it's a good answer. What was it that got you into journalism? When were you, so at school or at university when you were younger, were you into local newspapers or student newspapers?
I worked on my own student newspaper. I actually made fanzines when I was a teenager, so I was really into a genre of music called Riot Girl, and these were bands from mostly the Northwest, Pacific Northwest in America, and it was kind of like feminist punk music. And not many people were into feminist punk music, and I grew up near Scunthorpe. It wasn't a mecca for it particularly. But I used to make fanzines, and that was a way, I guess it didn't predate the internet, but it definitely predated the way that the internet exists now as a kind of communication thing. You know, you would check your email once every couple of days. It wasn't constant. So I would make fanzines as a way of meeting other people who were into the same music that I was. And that was really like printing stuff off and cutting it up and, you know, photocopying it at my friend's dad's office and posting them out. So I did that for a while, and then went to university, and then I'm trying to think how I actually, and then I was the music editor on my student paper.
At university, did you do a related course to
I did English literature.
Perfect.
Yeah. Although I don't know, I've always wondered how useful it was. I did a pub quiz last week, and there was a Shakespeare round, and I knew, like, I got most of those right, so I think my degree was actually useful. Yeah. Really felt like I'd got my money's worth.
And have you got any advice then for sort of aspiring journalists? I'm sure there are plenty in the audience today.
I think that if you can tell a good story, then there's always, always, always a place for that, always. And often people pitch stories, and I often get pitches from young journalists who say, I want to just tell you my opinion on, we get a lot of, this is Vice, so we get a lot of pitches from people who say, can you make a film about me and my friend smoking a lot of weed? That happens more than it should happen. Or I took acid for the first time and I really want to write about my experience. Anyway, we get those a lot. But I think you should use your world. Find your own stories by using your world. So use the kind of things that you know and you see, because other people don't have that. And I think the one advantage that, well, many advantages, but one of the advantages that young people have, is that as editors, we're sitting in an office most of the time. We're sitting in an office from, you know, I've got one of my colleagues here, so I'm going to say I'm sitting in an office from 8 till 8, around about then, in front of a computer. So the way that I see stories is kind of through the internet. But if, as young writers, you're out there existing and living your life and seeing things that I don't see, then you are at an advantage, and tell me those stories. I'm interested. If they're interesting to you, they'll be interesting to me. So I think make the most of what you have, and yeah. And be again, I said that we like unique stories, but be unique. There are so many people who want to be the same, and I never really understood that, because there are so many voices out there now. And I think that it's easier to be unique than you think when you're not trying to be like someone else. You know, there was a few years ago, everyone wanted to be like Charlie Brooker. Everyone would say, you know, no one can do what Charlie Brooker does apart from Charlie Brooker. He's brilliant, but no one else can do that. And so I think be yourself, be unique, and yeah, tell me a good story. That all sounds really glib, doesn't it?
No, that was really sweet. Great, I think that's everything from me.
Yeah.
Does anyone in the audience have any questions for Rebecca? Yes, at the back. Oh, sorry, if you wouldn't mind waiting for the mic, thank you.
Again, I was a music journalist for quite a long time, so my hearing is not as great as it should be.
Could you just talk a bit about your pay structure? Because I understand that you don't have a paywall on the website.
Yeah.
And you talked about the magazine a bit, but I can't imagine that's a major revenue. Sort of how that works and how you think going forward that would continue to work.
How the money comes in?
Yeah.
Well, there's two things. The first thing I would say, and this isn't me trying to kind of avoid the subject, but I think it's very healthy for a person in a position like me and the kind of editorial team to stay as far away from the money side as possible, because I think that's a terrible thing when you start to merge those two. That's not something journalists should be thinking about. I sometimes have to talk about that kind of thing with the ads team and with the sales team, but I would really like my editors to stay away from that as much as possible. So I don't know a great, I know the kind of basics, but it's something that I try and stay away from so that we can do journalism as kind of unencumbered as we possibly can. But I think, online ad sales, it's not a great place to be at the moment. I think a lot of people have found that that's the case. Vice has always done it slightly differently, and we make films that brands will put their name to, but the films kind of are their own films, and brands want to be associated with that. And that, yeah, I don't know if the magazine brings in much money. That's not something. Again, it sounds like I'm being evasive, but I think it's really healthy for editorial and ads and revenue to be very, very separate, church and state sort of affair.
Yes, in the grey jumper.
So I'm just wondering, what's the relationship between Vice UK and headquarters and other offices, and also in terms of video content, particularly these long-form documentaries? Where are those ideas being generated? Are they produced, like, are you all producing your own video content, et cetera?
So in terms of the kind of international structure of it, that's something that was very interesting coming from a newspaper that had, reporters and bureaus around the world. But Vice, I think, now has 36 offices in different cities around the world. And it's not just one reporter or two, that's like established offices with their own websites. And it's huge, and it's been brilliant for me, because if ever we want, if something is happening in Poland or in Romania, then we can just call that office, and they have a fully staffed office, and they can tell us, they can do the story, or we can talk, it's amazing the way that it works in that way. That's been really incredible. So I work very closely with our European director in terms of coordinating stories, and if I say, last week, the French butcher dentist who had been sentenced for kind of butchering his patients. It sounds like we've got a morbid streak, but I asked the French office if they could report on that. They found one of his victims who talked about her experience. It was really incredible. So in terms of Europe, we work like that. In terms of the US, we're relatively autonomous in the sense that we have our own editorial kind of structure and our own schedule, but we speak to them regularly, and we often run their stories on the UK site and vice versa. It's kind of like a big, it makes us look like we do twice as much work as we do, because we share their stories. Was there another? So we work with, there's a production team, there's a kind of editorial staff and the production team. But they'll read a piece and say, that would make a great film, let's talk about that. Or if they're doing a film that we've kind of know about, then we'll run editorial to go alongside that. It's just, again, I think this is one of the things that is a benefit of having a small team, is that we just talk to each other. And I say that like it's an obvious thing, that we just talk to each other, but I've worked in a lot of places where the culture is very much G-chat each other, and the office is silent and everyone's on IMs and things like that, but we actually talk to each other, and so, yeah, that's how it works.
Any other questions? Oh, yeah, in the red top.
The person in the red top. I think sort of Vice is like quite an anti-establishment force in lots of ways. I mean, how do you kind of like move away from the standard mainstream topics that are kind of put out by like the government's press office or whatever? And then also, how do you then go and get into these places and like film these amazing videos and stuff? I mean, do you think that there must be a difficulty in like trying to film someone who's basically beating another guy up? I mean, how does that work?
Well, so the first part of your question about the kind of anti-establishment thing, a lot of that is a choice. We made a choice to not have a Westminster correspondent. We made a choice to kind of resist, there may have been efforts to talk from the government to talk, from Number 10 to talk to us about stuff. That's not really, we're not interested in spin. We're not interested in that side of things, actually. If we're going to report on an issue, like you saw in the film, housing in London, if we're going to report on that, I don't really want to know what the government spin on it is. I want to know how that affects people who are being thrown out of their homes because the government's decided to sell off their council block. That's what I want to know. So we've made a choice to step outside of that and to not really play that game, and we don't, essentially. I think it's very rare that we interview politicians. We occasionally do, but not often. It's not something we chase, and it's not something we're particularly interested in. So that's the kind of first part. What was the second part?
It was about like how do you actually
capture
how do you capture it once you've kind of determined a rough area that you want to look at?
I think part of it is probably that because as a result of that, we have a reputation for being slightly anti-establishment, and that makes it easier for us to win people's trust, and people trust us. And again, also a big part of it is just that's journalism, and that's a real credit to the reporters and the producers who are making those films, and the photographers who are shooting the things that they shoot, is that they're very good at what they do. They're very good at what they do, and they can win people's trust, and people trust that Vice, I would hope, and that's my great ambition, is that people trust Vice to tell their stories honestly, or as honestly as it's possible to do. So, yeah, I think it's a trust thing.
I suppose building on that point from the audience about sort of the government spin on things, especially with something like the upcoming EU referendum, for example, when most of the facts that we get about events like that are from the media, do you not see that it's like very difficult for us? How do we pick out what we believe and what's true and what's...
But I trust you as a reader and as someone who has grown up with, presumably, in many, many, many different news sources, to kind of pick through and spot the things that you think you trust, or that you do trust. I trust. I think that's the thing. So many places don't trust their readers, and they feel like they have to guide them. And I think that we do trust our readers. Again, it's sophistication. Like you've all grown up with so much noise, and I would trust that you can pick out the things that you want to hear and that you want to see and that you want to read, and you kind of get a feel for the news source that suits you. And you'll read many other news sources. I would imagine that there's no way in the world that you would say, like, Vice is brilliant, especially after this, but like, Vice is brilliant, I'm only going to read Vice. And also, why would you? That's not something you have to do. You've the ability to choose, and I think that I trust our readers and readers everywhere to kind of educate themselves. And it's like engaging critically, isn't it, with what you read, like I suppose we're taught at university, and not just sort of reading it and taking it in and believing it necessarily. And if you look at the language around the things that we talk about now, the language around like a Beyonce album release. I've read so many stories about that, but the language is quite academic and it's sophisticated, and not all of it, some of it's terrible, but there are really important, intelligent, smart discussions being had about a Beyonce album, and I think that's a great place to be. Definitely. Have we got any final questions? Yeah.
I recently went to the Vice bar in London.
So the Old Green Last?
In Shoreditch, yeah. What's the deal with that? Have you been, and like, why does Vice have a pub?
I don't know. Great question. It is a great question. They have, I don't know. I was fairly useless on the business question before, and I think I'm going to be equally as useless on this. I don't know why they're in a pub, but they own a music venue as well. I guess it's a business thing, and I have been there. We get a discount if we're Vice staff. It's not a big one, but we do. And I had my birthday there this year because of the discount. So. Was it a good birthday? It was a great birthday.
Glad to hear.
Don't remember huge amounts of it again because of the discount. But
definitely was a good birthday.
It was definitely a good birthday.
At the back.
Thank you. Just a lot of the stories that you show in the video content as well show a lot of potentially illegal activity. I mean, how do you go about protecting the people that you show? I mean, have you ever had the police get in contact with you after you've run a video or a piece?
Not as far as I know, but people who are filmed always want to be filmed, and they always want their stories to be told, and I think that's really important. We would never film someone against their knowledge. We would never do anything like that. I think the people involved in our films want their stories to be told because they're not being told elsewhere. And again, that's the kind of thing that ties all of those films together, is that they're telling stories about... one of the other reasons that I was really excited about moving to Vice from The Guardian was that I felt like Vice always told stories about working class people, for example, that I didn't see anywhere else. And your earlier question about political bias, I think that there's a kind of class bias across the media, actually. I think the media starts at middle class and goes up. And, I'm from a working class background. I feel like my story is never really told in the mainstream media. And yeah, so those kind of stories are stories that are familiar to me and I think are really important, and the people in them want those stories to be told. That's the really important thing to remember. We're not exploiting anyone because they want that story to be out there because nobody else is telling that story.
We got any more questions? No? No more? Yes, Aditya.
So you talked about academic articles about the Lemonade album, and I've just been reading one in the London Review of Books, which is great. And I
haven't
guess
read that one yet, but I will add it to
it's
my
on the
list.
blog, so not huge. But one of my questions, and as someone sort of a budding journalist in the worst sort of way, in that not that journalism's bad, I'm bad, but in that sense, it feels as though word counts and word limits and attention spans are just assumed to be very small, and it feels like some of the stuff I've seen on Vice is a little bit more detailed, and you talked about trusting your readers.
Yeah.
But do you think that there's a risk with, say, BuzzFeed, say some of the shorter pieces that are coming out, the clicks, the lists, whatever, that we're expecting readers just not to have attention spans in the future, and to get their attention we need videos, and how does that sort of come through?
I think videos are important, and that's one of the things Vice has always been good at, but it's just a false assumption. The idea that, and it's talking down to you as a reader, the idea that you do not have the attention span to watch anything that isn't a cat gif. I would be insulted by that, and it's not true. I know that it's not true because I can see the amount of time that people spend on our articles, and if we do probably more longer reads than most sites. A lot of pieces we do are 3,000 words, plus we do shorter ones obviously as well, but we do a lot of long ones, and people stick with them and people read them through to the end. They spend enough time that we would assume that they're reading it through to the end. Yeah, I don't think you should let people assume that you're an idiot as a reader. It's ridiculous. And also there's a question of value, like how much value does it have if you attract someone who will click on a cat gif, to use that example? Are they going to be a loyal reader? Will they come back to your site and look for more stuff like that? Or do they just want to see a cat doing a funny thing? They probably just want to see the cat. They don't care where it's coming from. They just want to see the cat. So I think it's a question of value. To me, that doesn't, we're a small team and a relatively small site. I don't think that we would see that as, that's not the kind of audience that I think we should be encouraging. I thought you were going to ask me what my favourite song on Lemonade was. It changes, but right now between Freedom and Hold Up, what's okay. What's your favourite song on that one? Oh yeah.
Naturally. Okay, Rebecca, well, thank you so much for coming.
Thank you.
It's been really fantastic and really interesting, so thank you so much. And tomorrow, guys, is a big day at the Union because we've got Sigourney Weaver coming, and it's also the RAG auction. And then on Thursday, this week's debate is This House Believes That Masculinity is Damaging to Everyone, which I'm really excited about, so please come. But round of applause for Rebecca.